Fear, stress, and anxiety. I would be very nervous. We all have fears, the Archbishop explained. Fear and anxiety are mechanisms that have helped us to survive. You know, if you did not feel fear when you saw a lion over there and you just walked merrily by, in next to no time there would be no you. God has given us these things because God knew that we needed them. Otherwise, we would be fearless, but then we'd also be very stupid and we would not be around very long. The problem is when the fear is exaggerated or when it is provoked by something that is really quite insignificant. When I asked the Archbishop how he managed the fear during the dark days of apartheid, when he received frequent death threats, he said, "Well, one did not do silly things like stand in front of a lit window at night, but one had to say to God, 'If I'm doing your work, you better jolly well protect me.'" I have always been impressed with how the Archbishop has been willing to admit his fears and frailties. We so rarely hear about the doubts, fears, and worries of leaders, as leadership itself seems to require an air of confidence that rarely allows the admission of weakness or vulnerability. I was once told an amazing story by former Time magazine editor Rick Stengel, who had worked with Nelson Mandela on his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. Mandela was flying in a small propeller plane with his bodyguard, Mike. The great leader was hidden behind the morning paper when he noticed that one propeller was not working. He leaned over and calmly told Mike, who informed the pilots. They were well aware of the problem and explained that emergency landing procedures were in place. When Mike explained the situation to Mandela, he nodded calmly and went back to reading his paper. Apparently, Mike, a tough guy, was trembling with fear, but only calmed by the image of Mandela, who looked unbothered by the fact that they might at any moment fall out of the sky. When they had gotten into the back of the bulletproof BMW that met them at the airport, Stengel asked him about the flight, to which Mandela leaned in, eyes wide, and said, "Man, I was terrified up there." Even if leadership requires a show of strength during moments of crisis, our humanity is defined equally or perhaps even more by our weakness and vulnerability, a fact that the Archbishop often says reminds us of our need for one another. One of my favorite quotes that we included in Mandela's book Notes to the Future was on courage. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. I felt fear more times than I can remember, but I hid it behind a mask of boldness. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. Archbishop Tutu said something very similar when we were working on God Has a Dream. He said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it." The English word courage comes from the French word cœur, or heart. Courage is indeed the triumph of our heart's love and commitment over our mind's reasonable murmurings to keep us safe. As the Archbishop had said, it is when this natural fear gets exaggerated that we experience stress, worry, and anxiety. Many of us suffer from this general state of unease, during which we have floating fears and worries that attach to any experience or relationship. It is very hard to be joyful with stress and anxiety. We have a continual feeling of being overwhelmed and not being able to handle our work commitments, our family commitments, or the digital devices that are constantly reminding us of all the things that we are missing. Juggling so many things at the same time, we can feel like we are always one step behind. Jinpa pointed out that modern society has prioritized independence to such an extent that we are left on our own to try to manage lives that are increasingly out of control. He explained the life that the Dalai Lama and his people had in Tibet before the Chinese invasion. In the remote village of Taxter in the Amdo province, the Dalai Lama's family house, like the others in the village, was located on a plateau overlooking rolling grasslands filled with nomads and yaks. The Dalai Lama was one of 16 children, 9 of whom died in infancy. The nearest town was 3 hours away by mule. The boy, then called Lamo Thondup, slept in the kitchen, closest to the stove. Life could not have been easy for him and his family, so it was a surprise to me when Jinpa explained that life would have been much less stressful in a traditional village. For much of human history, whether in Tibet or Africa or anywhere in between, there were fears and worries, some of them major, like whether there would be enough food for the winter. But these concerns were made more manageable by having a close and connected life. While survival certainly is the greatest stressor of all, for which our stress response evolved, there is something different about the constant pressures and pulls of modern life. Although there would no doubt have been times of great stress and anxiety at the loss of crops or even the loss of a child, the daily rhythms would have been far less frenzied and unfocused. There is a wisdom that has been lost, Jinpa said. Our opportunities are so much greater now, but so too are our anxieties. I thought of the journey, both physical and psychological, that Jinpa had undertaken. From a life in a Buddhist monastery that was largely unchanged for thousands of years to the family life he now lives in Montreal. But if stress and anxiety are inevitable parts of modern life, how can we begin to confront these ever-present irritants? How do we make the ride smoother? How do we minimize the worry we experience? Stress and anxiety often come from too much expectation and too much ambition, the Dalai Lama said. Then when we don't fulfill that expectation or achieve that ambition, we experience frustration. Right from the beginning, it is a self-centered attitude. I want this, I want that. Often we are not being realistic about our own ability or about objective reality. When we have a clear picture about our own capacity, we can be realistic about our effort. Then there is a much greater chance of achieving our goals. But unrealistic effort only brings disaster. So in many cases, our stress is caused by our expectations and our ambition. What is too much ambition, I wondered. For someone raised in America, where ambition is a virtue in and of itself, the marriage of initiative and persistence, I was struck by his answer. Could it be that all of the getting and grasping that we see as our major ambition in modern life might be misguided? And perhaps the belief that more is better might be a recipe for stress and frustration and ultimately dissatisfaction? Perhaps it is a question of priorities. What is it that is really worth pursuing? What is it we truly need? According to the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama, when we see how little we really need, love and connection, then all the getting and grasping that we thought was so essential to our well-being takes its rightful place and no longer becomes the focus or the obsession of our lives. We must try to be conscious about how we live and not get swept away by the modern trance, the relentless march, the anxious accelerator. The Dalai Lama was urging us to be more realistic so we can come to some sense of inner peace now rather than always chasing after our expectations and ambitions for the next. Symptoms of chronic stress are feelings of fragmentation and of chasing after time, of not being able to be present. What we are looking for is a settled, joyful state of being, and we need to give this state space. The Archbishop once told me that people often think he needs time to pray and reflect because he is a religious leader. He said those who must live in the marketplace, business people, professionals, and workers, need it even more.